Today's daf we're going to be learning is Chullin daf Yud Zayin. This week's learning is sponsored by Rabbi Lisa Malik and Adi Weiner for the refuah shlema of David Rafael ben Rivka Ariana Eliezer ben Yamin, their 10-month-old grandson Davidi, son of Rivka and Charlie Gottlieb, who is having a cleft palate surgery. Please join us in praying for the refuah shlema of our precious little angel baby. Batzlacha. Okay, we're going to get started. Today's daf is, we're going to try the first part of today's daf. We're going to be figuring out what this means. Okay, hakol shochatin ve'le'olam shochatin. So we started this yesterday. Okay, remember the phrase. There's three phrases there. Hakol shochatin, okay, which sounds like everyone can slaughter or everyone can be slaughtered. Okay, we'll see you in a minute. Le'olam shochatin, you can always slaughter. And the last word was bakol shochatim, with everything. If you remember, then the Mishna said, except for the following things. Okay, which we'll get back to later. So the way the Gemara first understood this, and I say first because eventually we're going to reject all this, and at the end of Amud Aleph, and have a new interpretation entirely. But before we do that, we're going to have a whole long discussion about this very, very interesting machlokes, Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva, which is the topic of Gethet this week, which will go up later today, which is a very interesting, in-depth look at this whole machlokes about what went on in the desert and what kind of meat were they eating and all of that. So what we understood so far was hakol shochatim means even birds get slaughtered, hakol referring to the animals. Le'olam shochatim means animals always need to get slaughtered, which depended, we're now going to see two different opinions about what this means. So first we thought, Rabbah said that it's talking about Rabbi Yishmael. Okay, that the machlokes is about Rabbi Yishmael. The Mishna is referring to Rabbi Yishmael's opinion. If you remember, we said that when the Torah we're really going to analyze this section where the Torah talks about when you get into the land and you want to eat meat, you can slaughter it, eat it wherever you want, that kind of thing. So Rabbi Yishmael says that, what does that really basically tell you? That before they got into the land, they couldn't just eat meat whenever they wanted, right? That's the way we simply usually read this section, is that they couldn't just eat meat whenever they wanted. Why? They had to bring it as a sacrifice. And when they get to the land, as it says in the Pasuk also, you're going to be kirchat mimcha makom, when you're far away from the Mikdash, because the land of Israel is, even though we all think it's kind of small, but it was big, especially in those days, to travel from one part to the other. Every time you want to go eat meat, right, even nowadays, it wouldn't be so easy. You'd have to go to the temple and sacrifice it. So they permitted to, right, in the desert, it was much closer, so they permitted to have meat not as a sacrifice. Okay, now, what's the la'olam shochatin? Well, you might have thought that once they got into exile, maybe we go back to the way it was when they were in the desert. To which Rav Yosef said that would be absurd. Why would you think that? The whole reason why it was permitted, why in the desert you had to do it in the temple, in the Mishkan, and you couldn't eat it otherwise because you had to bring it to the Mishkan. But when there's no temple, forget about your farther. Right, in other words, and then when you get into the land, you can eat it whenever you want. That's because you were far from the temple. Well, how far? I mean, when you're in exile and there is no temple, you're pretty far, right? There isn't such a thing as being far because there is no temple. You have no way to sacrifice. Sacrifices, and that's where we ended with this difficulty of Rav Yosef on Rabbah's position. So comes Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef. He says it's Rabbi Akiva. Actually, I agree with you that what it's discussing is chronology, and it's discussing even once we're in exile. But I think it's actually according to the opposite opinion, which is Rabbi Akiva, who has a very interesting opinion here. The Braita says like this: right, when you get, this is the next pasuk after when, Yarchiv Hashem ekvucha, when you get into the land, when it says, and your distance from the temple, then you have to slaughter your animals. Rabbi Akiva omer, what is the pasuk coming to tell you? You must slaughter them. You can't just kill them any way you want, like stabbing them. Surprise, surprise. In the time of the desert, they were allowed to just kill animals any way they wanted, according to Rabbi Akiva. That's a fascinating machlokes. Were they not eating meat at all in the time of the desert? Or were they actually eating meat any way they wanted? They could just stab it and, no problem. And then what happened? So what's that pasuk telling you? When you get into the land and then you're far from the temple, well, then you have to slaughter your animals, okay, that are not being sacrificed. Like, you have to slaughter all your animals if you want to eat. Now, what's the lo olam shochatin? Also coming to tell you once exiled. But you might have thought once you're into exile, maybe this law of having to slaughter your animals is only in the land. But once you get exiled, maybe you can kill your animals any way you want. That's why it says, even after the exile, you still have to slaughter. Okay? Now we're going to have this question before. Okay, that's the way we understand right now, lo olam shochatim. We have one way to explain it, which Rav Yosef raised all sorts of problems, which is even after the exile, you are still allowed to shecht your meat, which we had a difficulty, right? Then it should lo olam shochatim v'ochlim, right? If you're allowed to eat meat, then it should be focused on the allowed to eat and not the allowed to slaughter. So Rabbi Akiva has a certain strength because he says you always have to shecht, which makes more sense. Even after the exile, you still have to slaughter. Okay, you can't just stab animals. Now again, Rabbi Akiva is very strange. What, they really ate animals that they just stabbed in the desert? Hard for us to imagine. Anyway, okay, that's tough. That's the debate. But now, before we get back and reject both these answers, okay, which we're going to eventually do, but we're going to get off on a tangent about these two opinions. Okay? First, they're going to ask, what's the root of their machloket? Rabbi Akiva saval basar ta'ava lo itzar klal. So Rabbi Akiva holds there was never, and that's what motivated him to say what he said, because he thinks there was never a prohibition to eat meat that whenever you wanted without sacrificing it. He thinks obviously you're allowed to eat meat whenever you wanted. So something had to change. What changed? Nechira to slaughtering. Okay? To shechita. Rabbi Yishmael savar basar nechira lo ishtri klal. Rabbi Yishmael thinks, which sounds more intuitively, correct to us, which is what you think Jews ate without slaughtering in the desert. That seems absurd. Okay, so he thought that was never permitted, and that's what motivated him to go with his opinion. Now we're going to do a series of bishlama. Bishlama is, this one makes sense according to this, but the other one really doesn't fit here. We're going to raise all sorts of questions, most of them questions of Rabbi Akiva. Eventually we're going to have a question on Rabbi Yishmael. Bishlama the Rabbi Akiva, hainu dechtiv v'shachatet ben abakar. Well, Rabbi Yishmael makes more sense according to the pasuk where it says. Now this is about korbanot, but the point is, it sounds like they're thinking that maybe even sacrifices in the time of the desert didn't need to be slaughtered according to Rabbi Yishmael. So when it says v'shachat et ben abakar, why did it say slaughtering if they were doing? Now remember, when it talks about the korbanot in the Torah, it's talking obviously about also when there's a temple, but it's also talking about when there's a Mishkan, right? If they're getting all the commandments, they built the Mishkan, and then they're getting the commandments for how to bring the sacrifices in the Mishkan in the desert. So there it says v'shachat et ben abakar, needs slaughtering. El Rabbi Akiva, my v'shachat. So that makes sense according to Rabbi Yishmael, who said they had to do shechita in the desert. But does it make sense according to Rabbi Akiva, who said they could have just killed the animals any way they wanted? To which we answer the obvious answer, which is kodshim shani. Okay, wait a minute. Rabbi Akiva obviously thought that sacrifices had to be slaughtered. The rituals had to be done in the proper way with slaughtering. Okay, it was only basar ta'ava, if you wanted to eat outside the temple, that Rabbi Akiva thinks that they didn't have to slaughter it. Bishlama, okay, second difficulty. Bishlama Rabbi Yishmael, hainu dechtiv, hatzon ubakar yishachet lehem. Now this is in the desert when they start complaining they don't have meat, right? They don't want the man. They don't have meat and all that. They're coming up on the parsha soon. Hatzon ubakar yishachet lehem. So Moshe says to God, there's so many people here. There's like 600,000 people. What you're gonna have son ubakar is going to be slaughtered for them, like tons of meat. What do we, Moshe's like, could it really be? And then God says, what, you don't believe in God? You don't think I could do this? So, but what does it say here? Yishachet lahem, which means will be slaughtered for them. So if they're talking about will be slaughtered, it means they have to slaughter it. Elal Rabbi Akiva, so it fits with Rabbi Yishmael that if they were going to, everything had to be slaughtered in the desert. There was no such thing as nechira in the midbar. But the Rabbi Akiva, ma'atzon b'char yishachet lahem, yinacher lahem ibayle. It should have been will be slaughtered for, right? Will be killed for them. Will be stabbed for them. The literal yinacher dechira often means stabbing, and again, it just means any way of killing them. Why would Moshe use the language of shechita if they didn't need to slaughter animals that they could eat, regular? So nechira lahen zo shechitatan. You could say that their nechira, they called it shechita. Shechita is just a catch-all phrase that includes also nechira, and that's the way to resolve the difficulty. Now we're going to move to a Mishna. Instead of a pasuk, we're going to take a Mishna that's going to also fit much better with Rabbi Yishmael. Bishlam ala Rabbi Yishmael hainu ditna. Now, we're talking about a halacha called kisoi hadam, covering the blood, which we're going to get to later in our Masechet, which is after you slaughter an animal, there's a commandment to to cover the blood, like put dirt, soil on top of it. Now, it says in the Mishnah, hashochet, okay, this is later on in Masechet, hashochet v'ninavla biyado, if you slaughter and it gets messed up and becomes a nevela, an animal that, let's say, it dies before you slaughter it, v'hanochel, or if you stab an animal, v'hama'akel, if you just take out the simanim, right, just uproot them without slaughtering them, without cutting them. Remember, the simanim is the windpipe of the gullet, the kanen, the veshet. Patur milachasot. Well, then you don't have to do kisoy adam because it wasn't a proper shechita. So now, el Rabbi Akiva, amai patur milachasot. Now, Rabbi Akiva, according to him, nichira, at least at some point in history, during the time of the Midbar, was a proper shechita. So if that's the case, theoretically, even if later it got forbidden, the assumption is you would need to do kisoy adam, since at some point they had to do kisoy adam, so this Mishnah wouldn't say, oh, you don't have to do kisoy adam for nechira, if nechira was a proper way of slaughter, again, proper way of killing the animal at some point. To which the Gemara answers an obvious answer, no. Ho'il ve'itzar, itzar. In other words, maybe in the time of the desert, you had to do kisoy adam after nechira. But once it became forbidden and you can't do nechira, then if you later do nechira in a time when it's forbidden, obviously you don't have to cover the blood, and that's not really a difficulty. Now we get to the difficulty on Rabbi Yishmael. These weren't the strongest difficulties, if you haven't noticed, okay? But they all have pretty obvious answers. Bishlam ala Rabbi Akiva damar basar tava lo itzar klal. Hainu dichtiv. Okay, now we're going to have this pasuk that is a hard pasuk to understand in general. But in the section where it talks about basar tava, which is the pasukim we read when you get into the land and when you're far away and all that, then it says, ach kasher ye'achel et hatzvi ve'et ha'ayil. The same way that now you eat the tzvi and the ayil, which you can see where this is going, because that means obviously now you can eat the tzvi and the ayil in the desert, which fits with Rabbi Akiva, that they could eat any animal they wanted, just kill it, whereas the tzvi and the ayil, according to Rabbi Yishmael, there was none. There was no basar ta'ava. You couldn't eat meat anytime you wanted, only to bring on the altar. Now, the tzvi and the ayil are called chayot. They're in the category of undomesticated animals. They can't be brought as sacrifices. No sacrifices brought with those animals. So this pasuk says, before we read the whole pasuk, but it says, the same way you're eating the tzvi and the ayil now, and I'll read you the rest of the pasuk, but that's the important part, which means they were eating the tzvi and the ayil. So, Ela Rabbi Yishmael, tzvi va'al gufei miyav ha'sharei, but they weren't eating the tzvi and the ayil. Okay, since we're already in the pasuk, I'll explain to you the pasuk, even though it's a very hard pasuk to understand. It says, the way you eat the tzvi and the ayil now, kain tochlenu, when you get into the land, that's how you're going to eat all animals, behemot as well. Hatamei v'hatahor yachdav yochlenu, meaning, now you eat the tzvi and the ayil, bitum'ah, in other words, you don't need a sanctity. You don't need to be pure to eat the tzvi and the ayil. So just like you eat those now in impurity, when you get into the land, you'll be able to eat other animals in impurity as well, meaning behemot. Okay, what this means is a good question, because if they were eating, right, sounds like when they ate animals that could be sacrificed, either they were only eating them as sacrifices and then you had to be pure, right? And the point is when you get into the land, you can now eat them in impurity, right? You don't have to be pure because you can eat them outside the temple. Right? That's one way of reading it. Anyway, it's a confusing pasuk what exactly it means, but the point here being that it sounds like they were eating tzvi and ayils in the desert. So that doesn't make any sense according to Rabbi Yishmael, who said you can't just eat meat whenever you wanted, you can only bring sacrifices. There were no sacrifices with those animals. So how do we explain it? Ki asa Rahman. Now, okay, I just want to stop for a minute. In the previous section, when we started with the difficulties on Rabbi Akiva, we thought that that Rabbi Akiva allowed nechira across the board, even in sacrifices. Then we limited and said, even though probably we all intuited that anyway, that really Rabbi Akiva's nechira is allowed for non-sacrificial meat, and for sacrificial meat you'd have to sacrifice. So now we're going to have again another limitation, but this time of Rabbi Yishmael. We thought that Rabbi Yishmael until now was saying they couldn't eat any meat they wanted in the desert, only meat that could be sacrificed, which means they were only eating shor, pal, keves, eggs, all those animals that could be sacrificed, lambs, right, etc. But now we're going to understand Rabbi Yishmael a little bit differently. Ki asa rachmana behema dechazil hakrava. The Torah only forbade now we're going to have two categories of animals. There's behemot, which can go on the altar. Those animals you couldn't eat at all in the desert if you wanted them, only as sacrifices. But the chayot, which don't go on the altar anyway, okay, you could act chayot that you can't sacrifice, lo asar rachmana, you're allowed to eat them. So with these psukim now, the way we understand Rabbi Yishmael differently than we understood Rabbi Yishmael before, if you're in the desert and you wanted to eat an animal, you're allowed to eat, right, deer and rams and things like that. Well, the ayil must be a different kind of ram because the elim do go on the altar, but it must be a different kind that isn't in that category, isn't what we call the ayil of that. But anyway, these are animals that can't go on the altar. Those you could eat on your own. But behemot, you couldn't eat on your own, only as a sacrifice. Okay, now we get to a question. Okay, we're still within our in-depth look into this whole machlokah Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Yishmael, by Rabbi Yirmiyah. Now, according to Rabbi Akiva, you could just stab animals or kill them any way you wanted in the desert. So comes Rabbi Yirmiyah with a classic Rabbi Yirmiyah question. Evrei basar nechira. What if I stab the animal or kill it any way I want in the time of the desert? And then I have the meat in my hand, I have some chunks, and I go into the land of Israel. And now we get into the land and, we're doing our thing. Can I eat that meat? Okay, so before we get to an answer or a non-answer, which we're going to end in a teku, but we want to understand what are we talking about exactly? When? Emat. If you're talking about the 7 years that they conquered, okay, remember they conquered for 7 years, then they settled the land for 7 years. So if you're talking about the first 7 years when they were conquering, of course you can eat the meat that you stabbed in the desert. Why is that? Okay, if something non-kosher is permitted to you when you're in time of war, okay, how do we know this? Because the pasuk tells you, ubatim aleim kol tuv. Okay, that when you get into the land, we're told that the houses are full of lots of yummy food, and you can take anything that's in the house. Okay, you can have the barot that you didn't dig, and the zaytim that you didn't plant, and the vineyards that you didn't plant. All that stuff you're allowed to take once you conquer the land, which means you can eat anything you want, even non-kosher food. But Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba and Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba quoted in the name of Rav, kutle de chazire. You can even eat pork. Okay, by the way, if your Hebrew's good, later today, Sugya B'Ktanav Dr. Umerav Tubukahana is going up. She talks there about like this heter to eat in a time of war and brings it relevant halacha l'maaseh today. Very interesting right now, also very relevant in Israel. Okay, so now the question is, if you're allowed, so now it's a little weird, then what's the question about? In other words, when exactly would you be eating this meat? You're not going to be eating it 8 years into getting into the land if you slaughtered it 8 years before, right? They didn't have freezers or anything like that. Even nowadays, you wouldn't freeze meat for that long. So right now, they're going to say, if you're talking about within the first 7 years, let's say the first week you get there, well, you're conquering already. And when you're conquering, you can eat anything you want. So, basar nechira mebayah. So we're going to ask a question about if it was kosher meat that you just stabbed, of course you can eat it. So the first answer is ela lachar miken. Maybe you preserve the meat, right? There is a way to preserve meat. They probably did that in those days as well. And if you preserve the meat and it was still there after the 7 years, that's the one possibility of his question. Second possibility, it really is a question in the 7 years. So what about the fact that they could go into a house and eat whatever meat they had there? Well, ki ishtralu shalal shel goyim didhu lo ishtrei. Notice what it says on the pasuk there. You can go into the land and eat things that you find there. It doesn't say you can eat your own stuff that's not kosher. So if your own stuff that you brought when it was kosher, but now it turned to be not kosher, because you got into the land, or is it not? Okay? So because it's your own stuff, we won't say that just because you're in the time of war, you can eat your own stuff that's not kosher. No, you can only eat the shalal. And then, which is a big, interesting difference of a heter, right? You're allowed to make non-kosher food. You're allowed to just pick up from, what you see non-kosher food, right? So that's another possibility. And then the question would be, okay, so the next day you're in there, you're starting the war, and are you allowed to eat the meat that yesterday was kosher? Does it turn to non-kosher just because you're in the land now? And the obvious answer, as I already told you, is teku. We don't have an answer to this question. Okay, that was all an aside. But it was all because we explained la'olam shochatim as chronological. La'olam means even later in time, meaning even when you're exiled. And we explained it either according to Rabbi Yishmael or according to Rabbi Akiva. You might have thought it went back to some earlier way, right? Whichever it was. And that's what the sentence is coming to say, either according to Rabbi Yishmael or according to Rabbi Akiva, right? Whether you're Raba or Rav Yosef, each one said a different thing. But now, Ela Amar Rava. Rava comes and says, I skip. Amar Rava. Shaneta akol shochatim, u'lo'olam shochatim. Well, we have to view this sentence as one long sentence. It says, hakol shochatim, everyone, right? Which we understood as not everyone, every animal gets slaughtered. Lo'olam shochatim, the animals get slaughtered even at a later period of time. And bakol shochatim, with everything, you can use anything to slaughter with other than the few things you can't. Now, bakol shochatim my mishanetle. He says, how do we read that? Like, what does it mean? Now, v'chitim, if you're going to assume it means what we thought, which is bein b'tzor, bein b'schuchi, bein b'krumit shel kaneh, these kind of implements that you're allowed to use, which is either a flint, we saw this before the other day, a schuchit, a piece of glass, or the stalk of a reed, hadumia dahana katani. But wait, these three have to be parallel. Parallel in what way? Ihanach b'shochatim, if these are talking about the shochet, meaning the shochet can use any implement they want, that would be the bakol shochatim, then hainami b'shochatim, then the previous two should be about the shochet. And ihanach b'nishchatim, but if the first two, which we explained already, are talking about what gets slaughtered, number one, right, the hakol shochatim, even birds, right, that's talking about what gets slaughtered. But la'olam shochatim is animals always get slaughtered, even after they left the land. So that's also b'nishchatim. Then the third one should be talking about nishchatim, should be also about the animals. And then bakol shochatim is the person, not the animal, right? It's with what implements can the person use. So, Ela Amar Rava, Rava says, we're going to reread, okay, bakol shochatim they can't really see means anything else. So they're going to now explain hakol shochatim and la'olam shochatim in a completely different way. Hakol shochatim, now, what's the problem? If you want to say hakol shochatim mean anyone can slaughter, okay, even someone, what's the problem? Well, this Mishna says it, but we already had it in the first Mishna. Remember, that's how our Masechet starts off. Hakol shochatim, and then we said, who does that include, right? So they're going to say like this. It says the same thing twice. Chada la'tuye kuti, v'chada la'tuye Yisrael mumar. They're each coming to include a different case. The first one, now this we already learned that they're all included, but we're going to say that the two Mishnayot include each one a different case. The first one includes a kuti. Remember, that was when the kutis were considered Jews, and they were still careful about shechita, so because of that we can rely on their shechita. And the Yisrael mumar, which is not a mumar for kol Torah kula. Remember, it's not or of Dazara. We had a machloket about that, but we're talking about a mumar ochel nevelot l'teavon. Remember, someone who will. We had a whole thing about it. Someone who will they'll always take the easy way out. So if it's just as easy to slaughter it properly, they'll slaughter it properly. Okay, they're only not going to slaughter it properly when it's when there's a difficulty and it's much easier to just eat non-kosher meat. But in slaughtering, it's just as easy to slaughter it kosher. So we're going to assume they did the right thing. And that's what each one is coming for. La'olam shochatim has nothing to do with what we thought, even after the exile. No, it means bein b'yom bein b'layla, meaning any time of day a person could slaughter, whether day or night, any place they are. Bein b'rosh hagag, you could be on a roof. Bein b'rosh hasfina, you could be on a boat, wherever you want. It sounds like that Dr. Seuss book, right? You could do it in a house, you could do it all that. So you could do it anywhere. And bakol shochatim, bein b'tzor, bein b'schuchi, bein b'krumit shel kaneh. And then the person can slaughter, right? So again, any person can slaughter, again, they within certain parameters. They can do it anywhere, anytime, and they can do it with any implement, other than the ones we're going to see not, and that's going to be the next topic. Okay? Chutz mi. So we finished now, and we reinterpreted that statement. Now we're going to move on to Chutz mi magal katzir v'hamikira. So now the Mishnah had said, let's go through the cases in the Mishnah. Okay, the Mishnah was on Daf Tevav. Okay, you can use a magal yad, you can use a tzur, a kaneh. Okay, that works. Then, right, so the magal yad is a hand sickle, a tzur, a flint, or a kaneh, or a reed. If you still haven't read Shuli's article on Flashback about flints, you could read them. You could read it now. other than a magal katsir, which is serrated. Okay, remember we talked about the magal yab is serrated on one side, flat on the other. So ideally you shouldn't use it, but if you do, it's fine. But this is completely serrated, the magal katsir. It's the one they use at the sickle in the fields. Migera is a saw kind of thing with a jagged knife. Serrated. Shinayim are the teeth of an animal, and siporen are the claws of the animal. Okay, the fingernails that are attached to the body. Now, all those things can cause chonkim, right? They can basically cause the animal to tear through the simanim before you actually slaughter it. So now, if you remember, we talked about the fact that you have to check your knife, and it could have nicks in it, and we're going to talk about what kind of nicks are problematic, right? What's going to be like a megera, for example. So, Avoid Yishmael pagam v'shadar pagam v'shadar. He kept messing up knives intentionally and sending them to the rabbis in Israel to tell him, is this okay, is this not okay? Okay, so he basically kept making nicks in his knives, sending it off to Israel, saying, tell me what the deal is. Can I use a knife like this? Can I use a knife like that? It was a way to get an idea of what was permitted, what wasn't. They sent him back, Shalchule, Kim Migera Shaninu. And they basically said, serrated edge. Okay, if it's a serrated edge, it's a problem. If it's not a serrated edge, it's not a problem. It's fairly simple. Tanu Rabbanan. Now we're going to have a brighter turning to Amud Bet. Sakin sheyesh bat gimot harbe, tidon ki migera. If it has a lot of nicks in it, then it's like a migera. V'she'en la'ela pgima achat. If it only has one, it's going to depend on what the one looks like. Ogeret psula. If it catches, it's disqualified. Misuchsechet kshera. If it's entangled or entangles, then it's fine. Okay, what does this mean? We don't know. Hechidamya ogeret, hechidamya misuchsechet. Okay, so basically we're going to say serrated edge, obviously no good. But if there's one nick in the knife, then the question is it what we call ogeret or is it misuchsechet? So now we're going to see which one, what each one is. Now, if you have pictures, okay, in the Schattenstein, in the Koren, I have Morot Hayomi with pictures in the back. Okay, if you have some pictures, it will definitely help you. Again, there's machlokot, so pictures don't always help, although in the Koren they do have a few different ones. I'm not sure that actually, are they different opinions or anyway, I don't remember. But there's lots of pictures around. If you don't have a picture, I'm going to try to explain it in words because its picture is much easier. But anyway, if you have, look. If not, I'll help you along here. So what is hechidama ogeret, hechidama misuchsechet, what does it mean? Again, ogeret, it catches, and that's problematic. Misuchsechet, it entangles, and that's okay. Amar Rabbi Elazar, ogeret mishtei ruchot. Ogeret is where there's two nicks. Okay, so we're talking about one nick, which has two sides to it. What does that mean? Okay, imagine you have a flat knife, and you just cut out a triangle. It's very easy to envision. You cut out a triangle. Now the problem is it has 2 points there. 2 sharp points. And we're going to see in a minute what the problem is with having 2 sharp points. That's going to be a problem. Misuchsechet is meruach achat. Now, how could it be meruach achat? Only on one side it has a sharp point. If you have a nick, it should be on both sides. Well, forget about a triangle. Let's say it's rounded, goes up and back down. So instead of cutting out a triangle, you cut like a triangle on one side, and then it just rounds. It goes like in a rounded, like a wave, kind of a little bit like a wave, but kind of like that going down. So it's not sharp on one side. It's only sharp it's not sharp on one of the sides. It's sharp only on one side. So now they're going to say, well, okay, why does that help? They're going to ask it as a question. From here, we'll understand what the issue is. Mishna mishtei ruchot. Well, what's the difference? In shtei ruchot, we're going to say, why is it a problem? Demor shakama machlish. Well, it's going to get caught first on, that's why it's called ogeret, catches. It's going to get caught first on the first nick as you're slaughtering. And when it gets caught, what's going to happen? Well, remember, the animal has a neck that's blocking the simanim. So the first thing that's going to happen is when it gets caught on the first nick, it's going to cause a nick in the animal, but it's going to actually cause a nick in the animal's neck first, in the skin. It's going to tear the skin. That's not a problem at all. So the morshakama is the first nick is going to kind of hit it and make a cut and machlish. It's going to weaken it. What it means by weaken is it's going to open the skin in the neck. Umor shabatra baza. Now, when you get to the second nick, it's now going to make it's going to just make a cut, right? Not a proper slaughter cut. It's going to get caught on the siman and cut one of the simanim, and that will make the animal treifa before you actually slaughter it. So that we get with the shtei ruchot. But even meruach echad, ad to chorfav disakina machlish, more shabaza, machlish, and then more shabaza. Forget that there's no nick on the first, right? So let's say you have the rounded part. So you start with the rounded part, and then you're going to get to the nick, right? Now, the point is that when you start slaughtering the animal and you're cutting it with a knife, forget that it doesn't have a nick there, but to get caught on, but as soon as the knife grazes over the neck of the animal, it's going to already tear the skin of the neck. Once it tears the skin of the neck, you're then going to get it caught on that nick, and then the nick is going to basically make a hole in one of the simanim and make it a treifa also. So why would that one be okay? Again, I'm reading in the words. Chorfa disakina machlish, it's the sharpness of the knife which will first cut through the neck, and then the more shabaza, and then the second one will basically baza, make an indentation, a cut. So they say, maybe it's talking about the kaima resha disakina. Maybe where the knife goes in, the rounded part, is just at the very beginning of the knife. So there's not enough of the blade to have cut through the neck yet. And only in that case are we going to allow, then it's going to limit this misuchsechet, this entangled one. Because only at the beginning, right, it's not enough of the knife there to actually cut through the neck, and then the nick will cut through the neck, and then you're going to be fine because the rest of the knife is flat. But what's the problem? Remember what happens? Sof ki ka'az lemachashla ki ata baza. There's holacha and hova'ah. Remember, you go in two directions. So it's very nice that, even as it doesn't help to be at the beginning of the knife, because you're going to go one way and you're going to tear it, and then you're going to go the other, you're going to, start cutting the neck. And then when you go the other way, it's going to again tear one of the simanim. So that's not going to help you because the knife goes in two directions. So they say, kigon she'olich v'lo hevi. Now we're going to limit. This whole thing of misuchsechet kshera is only if you only go in one direction. Because if you only go in one direction, when it hits that one nick, it'll tear, but it'll tear the neck basically. And then we won't have, so it's only if it goes in one direction. If it goes in the other direction. Also, by the way, depending on which direction you go in, you might not actually hit the nick, because if the nick is only on one side, then as you're going with the knife, if you're going toward the side where it's rounded, you're actually never going to hit into a nick because it's all rounded. So basically they're going to say in that case, it won't create a problem, but if you do in both directions, you're going to definitely have a problem and it's going to be forbidden. Okay. Amar Rav, shalosh midot b'sakin. So there's 3 rules about a sakin, like 3 kinds of ways it can be done. Ogeret lo yishchot, v'im shachat shechitato psula. So the first 2 are a review of what we just said. If it's got like the triangle-shaped nick, so you can't slaughter, and if you did, it's disqualified because we assume you made the animal a treifa before you actually slaughtered it. Misuchsechet, if it's the entangled way, lo yishchot ba lechatchila, don't use it ideally. V'im shachat shechitato kshera, but if you did it, it's fine. Again, assuming you didn't do holacha v'hava'ah, right? You didn't go in both directions. Olevi yoreh b'sakin. Now this one we didn't discuss yet. Shocheh b'lechatchila. Olevi yoreh means it goes up and down. Again, there's different opinions among the commentaries, but the mainstream opinion is it's like a wave. Okay, where the waves are rounded, so there's no nicks. It's all just rounded. So if the knife goes up and down in a rounded in a wave kind of formation, then you can actually use it lechatchila because there's no nick in it, and you're not going to be worried that it's going to tear through any of the simanim. Amar le Rav Acha b'Reid Rav Nechemya le Rav Ashi. We're not going to have a whole bunch of discussions with Rav Ashi about how to do this. Remember, he was one of the last Amoraim, so often what he says is becomes halacha, because we have a concept of halacha kibatrai, okay, which is we pass on like the last people. So maybe that's why they have a lot of discussion with him. Also, he was the editor, so it could be also that's why a lot of his statements are in here. So Rav Huna b'Reid Rav Nechemya said to Rav Ashi, Amar la mishmei de Rava, you told us in the name of Rava that misuchsechet is psula, that it doesn't work, the entangled one, even though we just said it does. And they said to him, V'hama Rava misuchsechet kshera, but we saw Rava say, we heard him say, that misuchsechet actually works. So what's happening here? So lo kasha, and this is basically what we saw before, kan sholich ve'evi, kan sholich ve'lo hevi. If you go in one direction and you end up slaughtering cutting the simanim, when you go in that first direction without going back, then it's fine. But if you had to go in both directions, then it's not okay. Amalei Rav Acha b'Reid Rav Avia le Rav Ashi. So now someone else. Rav Acha says to Rav Ashi, Damya l'sasa mai. What if it looks like the what's called the awl of the, I think that's what the word is, right? The awl of the grain, the stalk of grain. On, thank you. I knew it didn't sound right. the on, thank you, of a stalk of grain. Okay, so if you remember, first of all, it's Shavuot, there was all these pictures going around, right, of stalks of grain. So it's a perfect holiday to be talking about this. Now, if you've ever touched one of them, right, they're very bristly, and they're, right, so you touch them. If you look at them up close, in a microscope maybe, but if you look at them up close, you'll see that there's little teeny nicks in them, and that's why they're bristly. Okay, there's little. We're talking about the stalks that come out, right? The stuff at the top of the stalk of wheat. So the on there has these little teeny nicks in it. So he says, what if your knife is like that, where they're teeny, teeny, teeny nicks? Are those problematic? Amar le, Rabbi Ashi said, Man yahavlemi bisrei v'achilon. You give me meat from a knife like that, I'll eat it. Okay, that's totally fine. I was wondering if our serrated knives are considered small enough, right? Our serrated knives, they're usually pretty small, right? Or are those considered problematic? Okay, it's good. I didn't look up halacha l'maaseh, but it does sound like this is maybe these are though closer to microscopic and those are not. So I don't know. Amar Rav Chisda, minayin lebedikat sakin min haTorah. Where do we get that you have to? Where do we see in the Torah that you have to check the knife to make sure there's no nicks in it? Shenemal. So now we're going to quote a pasuk from the Navi, from Shaul HaMelech. He says, "Ushchatetem bezeh va'achaltem." He tells the people, everybody bring me your shor, your seh, and shchatetem bezeh, and slaughter it with this. What do you see with this? You must have checked the knife. And from there you learn you have to check the knife. Pshita. Dechev and dechi nakiv treifa by a bedika. In other words, since if you make a nekev, it's going to be a treifa, of course you need a bedika. I don't need a pasuk in the Nevi'im, in the prophets, to tell me this. It's obvious that you have to check your knife, because if your knife has nicks, it's going to make it a treifa. Of course you have to check it. Well, what are we asking? To which they say, Lechacham kamrina. No, I was actually asking, okay, Rav Chisda says, what I was asking is, where do we know that we have to show it to a chacham to check the knife? And that we learn from Shaul HaMelech. Okay, because he was the king and he had checked the knife and then he had showed it to them. So he was considered like the chacham of the city. V'hamar Rabbi Yochanan, but wait, we need a pasuk from the Torah or from the prophets to teach us that you need to show it to a chacham? What are you talking about? Lo amru ahamar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan said, we saw this already before, Lo amru laharot l'sakin l'chacham l'pnei kvodo shel chacham. It's just an issue of respect for a rabbi. It's not a Torah law. We don't need to find a source in the Torah for that. That's just something the rabbis institute out of respect for the rabbis. I keep thinking, like, what rabbi would want to check everybody's shechita knives? They're busy with lots of other things. I don't know why that's respect for the rabbi, but they view this as respect for the rabbi. Like, I'm trying to think of the rabbi all day long looking at people's shechita knives in the city. But, okay, but assuming that was respect for the rabbi, it's certainly not a Torah law, so why are you looking for a pasuk for it? To which the Gemara answers, Midurabanon, Kras Machta Ba'al Mahu, the classic answer. No, it's really a rabbinic law. It's just I wanted to find some sort of allusion in the Torah so people could remember this. Okay? And the remember is bezeh, shchatetem bezeh, with this. Now we're going to learn about how to check the knife. B'ma'arava badchule b'shimsha. They checked it in the sun. Rashi gives two interpretations. What does it mean, the sun? Either it means the sunlight. Okay, we'll get to this when we learn nida. They would check tamim, like colors of blood. They would do it in the sunlight because their light in the houses wasn't very good. So the sunlight. Or some people say they would check it with the shadow using the sun. And you could see much better in the ground, right? Because it's like a microscope, okay? When the shadows are larger, so then you can see much better. Is there a nick? B'naharda, okay, now we're seeing. So that was how they did it in Israel. We're going to see all different customs where people, in the city of Naharda, Abad Kula B'maya, they would check it in water. Okay, they would take the knife, slide it on the water, and if the water started moving at a certain point, right, if it was smooth, then you would notice in the water it was smooth. If it wasn't, you would notice something happened in the water as you were moving it through. Rashi also suggests some other explanation, but we'll go with that. Rav Sheshet Badagla Bereish Lishane, this sounds unpleasant, he would check it on the tip of his tongue. Okay. Rav Acha Bar Yaakov Badagla Bechut HaSa'ara, he would take a hair and he would run the hair along the blade, and if it would go smoothly, he would know there was no nick. If it would jump, then he would know there was. Bisura Amre, in Surah they would say, Bisra Achla, Bisra Livdike. It's going to go on the meat, on the flesh, so it has to be checked on the flesh. Okay, you have to use it on something that it's going to eventually go on. Amra Papa, Tzricha Bedika Abisra, Va'atorfa, Va'atlata Ruchata. You have to check it on the meat. You have to check it on a claw, like on a fingernail kind of thing. and on all three sides. You have to check it also, meaning on the blade and on the sides of the knife, okay? The two sides of the blade, right? Remember, we talked about this earlier, and we're going to make reference to that again in a few minutes. But both sides have to have no nicks, and also the blade itself, the sharp part. Amarle, so that's what Rav Papa said. Amarle Ravina le Rav Ashi. So now again, Ravina says to Rav Ashi, they're going to quote him something he said. Amar lam Rav Sama bereid Rav Masharshia mishmach. I heard Rav Sama, the son of Rav Masharshia, say in your name. Okay, they're checking, like, is this true? Da'amar le mishmei de Rava, that you said, Rav Ashi, you said in the name of Rava, this is what you were quoted as having said in the name of Rava, tzricha bedika abis Rava, torfa v'atzlata ruchata. So exactly as Rav Papa said, you need these two different checks, and you need to do it on all three sides. Okay, both on flesh, on nail, and also on all three sides. Amar le abisra torfa amre, atzlata ruchata lo amre. I did say on the bisra and the torfa, but I didn't say on all three sides. Okay, I don't know who said I said that, but that's not what I said. That's the first version. Ikeda amre, abisra, right, which basically means you only have to check the blade. Some people say that his response was, Abisra torfe v'atzlata ruchata amre. I did say exactly as you said, but you got one thing wrong. Mishmei de Rava lo amre. I didn't say in the name of Rava. Okay, don't misquote me. Ravina Rav Acha berei de Rava havu yatvu kamei de Rav Ashi. So now Ravina Rav Acha, the son of Rava, was sitting before Rav Ashi. Aitu sakin the kamei de Rav Ashi levadka. So they brought him a knife to check. Amarle Rav Acha berei de Rava bidka. So he says to Rav Acha, you check it. Badka torfa v'abisra v'atzlata ruchata. He did all those checks, okay, on the basar, on the torfa, on all three sides. Amarle yaisher. Rav Ashi said, good. It's good you checked like that. Which sounds like Rav Ashi really did think you needed it on all three sides. By the way, there's a gematria there about bizeh. Bizeh is 12. Or I guess zeh is 12. So, and it's 12 checks because bisra, a torfa, and on all three sides, right? Does that work out? All three. Yeah, on each one you have to do 2. So that's 4 times 3. Okay? No? Is that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6? No, there's something I'm missing there. But there was someone who said it was 12 and I forget how they did it. Okay. Anyway, 3, 4, no, I don't know. Okay, fine. We'll leave that aside right now. So he said, great that you did that. Rav Kahana, he also required all those checks. Rav Yemar Amar Torfa Bisra Tzricha Atzlata Ruchata Lo Tzricha. But Rav Yemar came and said, you don't need on both the sides. You just need the blade. And he's going to prove it from the sugya we saw earlier where we talked about this. Because if you remember from the beginning of the Masechet, Milo Amar Rabbi Zera Amar Shmuel, he says, didn't Rabbi Zera say in the name of Shmuel, Liben Sakin v'Shachapa Shchita Kshera? If you heated up the knife and then slaughter with it, it's fine. Why is it fine? Shechiduda kodem l'libuna. Because first, the blade is going to hit it before the heat from the sides hits it. And by that point, right, v'kashelan ha'ikat tzadin, they said, what do you mean? Aren't the sides of the knife going to touch it and burn it and then basically cause it to be a treifa? V'amrinan, and they answer, beit hashchita mirvach ravach. Remember, it's like a balloon. As soon as it hits, right, the blade of the knife hits, the simanim open up, and the sides of the blade never really hit it. So, hachanami, say the same thing here, beit hashchita mirvach ravach, and the nicks on the sides of the knife are not going to do anything. Okay, so you don't have to worry about it because by the time it slices the simanim aren't touching the sides of the knife anymore, and therefore there's no need. Okay, last statement for today. Amar Rav Huna bar Rav Katina, Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, Shalosh pgimot hem. There's 3 pgimot where there's a pgima, which is what we're talking about here, a nick or not in something, okay, a notch, in something that's going to create a problem, and the requisite requirement for, or the requisite amount that's going to ruin it, okay, make it an issue, is the same for all these 3 things. Number 1, pgimat etzem bepesach. You're not allowed to break the bones. Lo tishbru etzem, right? Etzem lo tishbru bo. You can't break a bone. If you break a bone the size of a pgima, okay, which we're going to see what that size is in a minute, or not exactly. We'll wait till tomorrow, almost, but you'll see. Okay, in the Korban Pesach, that will be, you need a pgima can ruin it. Pgimat ozen bebechor. If you have like a cut in the ear of a donkey, of a bechor, sorry, not a donkey, a bechor, a firstborn, that's going to ruin the bechor, right? Bechorim are supposed to be slaughtered, right? Depending on kind, but a bechor of an animal can be sacrificed, supposed to be sacrificed, but not if it has a mum, then you can just slaughter it and eat it. So here, by the way, it's not just the ear. There's a whole slew of them in the Mishna about what, but they're basically saying, reference that Mishnah, all the pgimot in a bechor, and one of them is the ozen, the ear. P'gimat mum bekodshim, in regular kodshim, a mum, a blemish, okay? So there's a p'gimat, like a nick in one of them, in an animal that causes it to be a mum. Rav Chisda amar af p'gimat sakin. Now they said there's three. Rav Chisda added the p'gimat sakin. Now these are all the same in what way? We'll see in a minute. But before we get there, just why didn't the Tannaitic mention, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, why did only Rav Chisda mention the sakin? Why didn't Rabbi Lakish say so? Idach bechulin lo kamari. He wasn't dealing with chulin. He was only talking about in the world of korbanot. Okay, because the mum, right, in the bechor, the mum in the animal, and the p'gimat etzem on Pesach, those are all sacrifices. So we just didn't mention the p'gimat sakin. The kulan, here's the similarity about them, the reason why they were putting these together. P'gimatam kedei p'gimat mizbech. They all have the same size of disqualification that the altar does. Now the altar has to have, the stones have to be smooth, and if there's a nick in one of the stones, it ruins the mizbech, ruins the altar. So it's the same size as the p'gimah of the mizbech. Okay, all these nicks. Even though we didn't yet say what it was, tomorrow we'll see what exactly the requisite amount is. Okay, so that finishes our daf. The first part of our daf is understanding the line, which ended up reinterpreting the whole thing, but it started with lo olam shochatim. What does that mean? We thought it related either to Rabbi Akiva or to Rabbi Yishmael's position, and it was talking about chronology. In the end, after getting in a whole back and forth about their two opinions, it's very interesting machloket. This machloket we decided has nothing to do with our topic, and lo olam shochatim actually means, right, that you can, again, we had to reinterpret the whole thing. Hakol shochatim is not also birds. Hakol shochatim is all people, meaning even a mumar. Ochel nevilah l'te'avon was included here. Lo olam shochatim, daytime, nighttime, on a boat, all those options. And with what can you slaughter? And that was with all implements other than the following that you can't. That got us on a whole discussion of which ones you can't. And what a p'gimah is. We talked about the difference between a mesupsechet and a nogeret. None of them are ideal, but the mesupsechet actually could work if it was rounded and 1 point, one sharp part, one nick, and then we got from there to how do you know you need to check it by Torah law, and then how do people do the checks, and then what part of the knife needs to be checked, and we saw different opinions about that, and then we ended with other p'gimot and how they're all the same shiur, and with that we finished for today. Wishing everyone a good day, a Shavua Tov, and a Chodesh Tov.